September 10th, 2024, Audit and Finance Committee meeting. We acknowledge we are on the traditional lands of Treaty 4 territory, a treaty signed with 35 First Nations across southern Saskatchewan and parts of Alberta, Manitoba, and the original lands of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dakota, Nakota, Lakota, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. The City of Regina owes its strength and vibrancy to these lands and its diverse Indigenous peoples whose ancestors' footsteps have marked the territory, as well as the settlers from around the world who continue to be welcomed here and call Regina home. Some members of committee and city administration may be attending the meeting today through video conferencing. I'd like to remind those individuals the following. Please ensure your video camera and microphone are turned off. If a member of committee wishes to speak, use the raise hand function to be placed into the queue. When speaking, remember to unmute your microphone and enable your camera, and all votes will be conducted with a recorded vote. Reports recommended for consideration by City Council will be considered at its meeting scheduled for September 25th, and the deadline to register as a delegation for this City Council meeting is 12 noon on Monday, September 23rd. With that, I need to have approval of the public agenda. Can I have someone move a motion to approve the agenda at the call of the chair with the following adjustment? An administration report respecting Bank of Montreal extension as agenda item AFC 24-28. Thank you, Mr. Humphreys. I'll call the question. Any opposed? I see no opposition. Next up, can I have someone move a motion to adopt the minutes of the public meeting held on June 20th, 2024? Mayor Masters, does anyone note any errors or omission in the minutes? None noted. I'll call the question. Any opposed? Noting no opposition, we'll move along. First up, we will consider item AFC 24-24, the 2024 mid-year forecast. Can I please ask Deputy City Manager, Mr. Ted Schisler, to introduce the report? Oh,
thank you, Mr. Chair. We are here today to share the general operating and general utility funds mid-year forecast for 2024. This report also includes supplemental information on overtime and reserves. The mid-year forecast reflects a $2.4 million deficit in the general operating fund and a surplus of $3.3 million in general utility. Please note this forecast is subject to change as the fiscal year progresses. There's a number of details in their report, and I'm sure there will be some questions and discussion, and my colleagues are here to answer any of them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schisler. Is there any questions for administration from the committee? Mayor Masters, please go ahead.
Sorry, no one else's light was on. Bob's welcome to go first if you'd like. All right. I'll just start with one. There's an increase of 1.9 million from the deficit reported, 476,000 in first quarter, and it relates to a higher revenue forecast from taxation, government grants, bank interest, and investment gains, licensing and fines offset by overtime costs and inflationary grant costs. Can you just explain that, please? Because we went up a 1.9 million in a deficit, but the list was all revenue gains, right?
So, through the chair, the deficit increase from the first quarter can be mainly related to some of the reserve transfers that are occurring as a result of increased revenue. If we recall, Council had made a decision a little while ago about redirecting excess investment income to the Asset Revitalization Reserve and to the General Fund Reserve at a 50-50% split. And there is over 300 million forecasted in this second quarter forecast that will have to be shown as a transfer into the reserve, which increases our expense.
Sorry, 300 million?
No, 3 million.
Thank you. Sorry, that doesn't answer, sorry, I appreciate that, okay. But the increase in the deficit relates to higher revenue forecast from taxation, government grants, bank interest and investment gains, licensing and fines, offset by overtime costs and inflationary. So our revenue went up, but we're in a $1.9 million deficit. So understanding that we have essentially, you have a budgeted number for investment revenue, and I think this year it's $9 million-ish. Have I got that
10.
right? That's what's budgeted? So we've
10.
made more than that, but what does that have to do with the deficit?
So we have to show an offsetting expense to the reserve from the revenue.
Okay,
And so later on in the report, it does talk about the forecast is reflecting the transfer of reserves that are protected. So winter road maintenance has a projected savings right now because of less snow events. So our reserve policy and our bylaws note that any surplus in that program gets transferred to the winter road maintenance reserve. That one was reflected in the first quarter, whereas the investment income was not reflected in the first quarter.
okay. But I'll say again, if you've budgeted and you've exceeded budget on revenue, and that revenue is a set aside, that must mean there's deficit elsewhere. Because you've met your revenue.
Agree.
So what are the expenses that are causing the deficit?
So they are made up of a multiple amount of different, multiple different items, inflationary costs. Overtime is an offset as noted in there. We do have unbudgeted operating expenses that can be tied to some of the warming shelter costs and the temporary shelter. We have some items that are unbudgeted in roadways. It's made up of multiple little amounts that essentially that cumulatively account for the deficit.
Okay, I'm going to maybe let this go, but I'll just ask one more follow-up question. If you're over in revenues and there's direction by policy to put it into reserves, that's not causing a deficit. But that is how this report is written in two different pages, on page 2 and again on page 4. So it's more a matter of, I'm taking issue right now with there is no descriptives, and I appreciate it's in line items, I can go find it, I went and found it, I understand that. But the way the report is written is, gosh, we made too much money and we're told that any revenue made over budget has to go here, therefore we're in deficit, when that's not the case.
No.
Right.
No, I would agree. It is an impact based on how we have to account for the transactions, but I would agree that that is not the specific reason for the deficit. It is made up of a multiple other operating expenses that have accumulated to that amount.
Okay. Thanks, Bob. I'm good, Chair, for now.
Mr. Humphries, please go ahead.
Through you, Jason, this AFC 2424 deals with a whole myriad of issues. The first one on here was the approval of the 1.33 million for the riders, so we took the write-off. How are we going to go through this? Like, and then there's overtime, and then there's, should we just speak now on questions we have pertaining to the midterm report? Are we going to vote on the riders thing?
I guess, looking at the
sorry.
report in front of us, it's mainly informational for what's going on with the various spends on top of the one extra spend for the riders.
Right.
Nothing's been voted on for the riders yet. This is the Audit and Finance Committee.
Right.
That is a finance matter, If you want to make a suggestion that we should pass along to council, I guess it would be a good amendment to make if you have an alternate suggestion instead of what's been there.
Okay.
But we should really vet it first as to what the job the administration's done, trying to get rid of that problem for us ahead of time.
Sure, I'm just wondering in what order we take this. Do we take the riders, then do we take the midterm, and then do we take the overtime? Like, I could talk for an hour or ask questions for half an hour on the whole thing, but I don't.
Yeah. I guess if I was going to give a little bit of input, I'd say the rider sounds like a big topic to you. You brought it up pretty quick, and it is a pretty glaring piece on this, so that'd be a good
right.
one to discuss.
Okay,
And when we get to the other side of things, as long as we could get it at a high level,
Right, yeah, that's
high
nice, yeah,
operation
yeah,
level for
sure,
how it
yeah,
affects
for
things
sure.
is all we got to shoot for.
Yeah, that's my intent, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, I'll
I hope
start
that's
with,
good.
sure, I'll start with the riders then. And I just want to make sure that I understand the recommendation and the circumstances behind the recommendation. The 3.6 million was for the total rent that should have been realized for 2020, 2021? Is that the case?
So I'll start with some of these, and Ms. Kurluck and I will probably bounce back and forth through the chair. Just let me find the right page. I believe that's accurate through the chair.
That's accurate? Okay. Can you detail how the 1.33 million write-off was arrived at?
Yeah, there were negotiations and discussions between the city and the football club. The terms of the arrangement allow for consideration of foregoing rent under situations of force majeure. The entire season was canceled by the league due to COVID, et cetera. So there's a bunch of stuff there. And through discussions back and forth, I wasn't involved in them myself, between the riders and the city, determining what portion of the premises and et cetera that are covered by the lease were actually able to be used by the riders during that period versus parts that weren't, and arrived at an agreement in dialogue of this amount being a write-off, the rest being due and payable.
Thank you. Through the chair. Now, the alternative implies that if the city doesn't accept these terms, the football club may refuse to pay. Is that correct?
Through the chair, I don't want to speculate on what they may or may not do.
Okay.
They certainly could,
Right.
and then we would pursue other discussions or legal remedies, but it would,
Right.
there have been discussions so far, and this is sort of the end result of those discussions back and forth.
Through the chair. Now, is the same level of compassionate negotiation used to write off the debt for residents and businesses who are unable to pay their property taxes?
Through the chair, I'm not sure how much that applies. This is a commercial contract, and there are terms in the contract that allow for force majeure and discussions, but it's a totally different context than a taxpayer and their taxes on their home. And Ms. Kurluck wants to add.
So, through the chair, I'm just going to add that, and I might pass it off to Ms. Mills, but I'll start with the consideration of COVID and the pandemic. There were measures that adjusted, I guess, how we collect receivables in order to accommodate instances with the pandemic. And this would be one of those instances. So I'm not sure, I can't speak to the details for delayed collections and those types of things. But I'll maybe let Ms. Mills speak to that more directly.
Thank you, through the chair. So during the pandemic, we did extend the property tax deadline. We also paused our tax enforcement processes for all properties. In some instances, we also implemented, I would say, the official name of the program is not coming to me at the moment, but we did implement a program where if residents are on a payment arrangement, we do reduce the penalty applied for property taxes. So those are kind of the things we implemented for property taxes, but I would go back to Mr. Schirzler's opening comment in that this is a commercial contract and not related to the property tax for the facility.
Through the chair, How was the $1.3 million loss accounted for in a 2023 budget?
I'll ask, Mr. Chair, I'll ask Ms. Krulak to respond to that.
Please go ahead.
Through the chair, the 1.3, if you recall, we did come forward last year in 2023 flagging this item, I believe in the mid-year and the Q3 forecasts, saying that it would be a consideration. And then in the year-end report, we did actually adjust our bad debt allowance to allow for this write-off. So this item has been expensed in a prior year or allowed for in a prior year. And if the approval to write off this item occurs, then there's actually not an impact to current year expense, as it would be offset against the bad debt allowance.
All right. If this motion, I assume this is going to come for a vote, is it, Jason? Is this going to come for a vote? Yes, okay. Yeah.
It will come to a vote, and in addition to that, I haven't actually had a mover for this piece of policy yet, so if I could get you to move it. Oh, Mayor Masters? Okay, and now it's properly on the floor. Please go ahead, Mr. Humphries.
Okay. I'll just say right now that I can't agree with the recommendation to write off the $1.33 million for the following reasons. COVID hit everyone hard. If we write off the rider's debt, even though it was a commercial contract, we should use the same approach to write off the debt for businesses, residents unable or unwilling to pay their property taxes. In the past 2 years, I've had to investigate the steps the city takes respecting default on property taxes, unfortunately. Writing them off is not an option. In my view, treating the riders differently is wrong. To date, the residents of this city have already had to cover Q's costs of $8 million, for real, $900,000 for EDR, and I believe the city residents have already done more than their share respecting COVID compensation. The Saskatchewan Rough Riders is a professional football team and should act like it, respecting their fiscal and debt situation. Many residents like myself can't even afford to go to a Rider game, yet we're being asked to pay to write off $1.33 million. And that just isn't right in my mind. I would propose, if it comes to it, an alternative motion that states something to the effect that contingent on the riders paying $2.2 million on demand, the city agrees to enter into a 15-year interest-free repayment agreement for the $1.33 million outstanding balance. And I have other questions respecting the mid-year term forecast, but I'll just leave it for discussion of that one there. Thanks, Jason.
Thanks, Mr. Humphries. Ted, please go ahead.
Sure. I think you, on this item, the notion of a write-off on it, I think what you're saying is that the contract has a provision that, rent isn't owed or lease isn't owed if there's not an ability to use the facility, or like you said in the force majeure. I assume you've got some legal opinion on that? Because I think that's what, when people hear the write-off, and I was going to ask you about your write-off policies, the specific language that allows you to write something off. I know in the province it's very specific and very narrow around what allows you to write something off. I don't think this fits those general categories. It's something else. So I'm not sure I'm leaving you with a question here. I guess how do you want to address that challenge of speaking to a write-off where really it's you collected rent money that you legally weren't required or allowed to collect? And I think there's a legal issue here around the contract.
So through the chair, I think we did get a legal opinion before proceeding with this, and if you wanted to discuss that, we would probably need to go in
I don't need to know
camera.
need to know the details of it. I need to know that you got one.
Yes, we did.
Good, yeah. And it supports the recommendation that you would,
Correct. We wouldn't,
you overcharge them.
We wouldn't have proceeded if we didn't feel we had
Right.
appropriate counsel in that regard.
Okay. Is it a write-off in that case, Kim? I guess,
technically, it could be viewed as a cancellation of debt, as there is a receivable on the books. So we would have to do, through the chair, we would have to manage the accounting side of things for the entry. So, and ensure that our books were accurate. So it would either be proceeded as a cancellation or a write-off.
You're going to have a difficult time with this one, just with the language and explaining that this is not like my property tax. If you go down this path, if council chooses to do this. If council doesn't, I just want to know the other side. If council chooses not to do this, again, are you finding yourselves, is your expectation, is your legal advice that you might find yourselves in court or what?
Through the chair, there is that possibility.
Yeah. I'm just going to leave it at that.
Actually, just listening to the back and forth about the legal opinion on this and how it might affect, could I get a little short strokes on how that looks, a little bit insight from legal, just on, oh, Ted, whoever, please go ahead.
I think we need to, in order to, and we're ready to do that, we have our legal team here, but we'd recommend, Mr. Chair, we go on camera to do that.
Okay, I guess maybe we'll in camera for a minute then. Okay, Mayor Masters move a motion, go in camera. Any opposed? Okay, I'll have a small in camera session. public meeting. Just take a second to express to the public that we stepped into private to receive some information about the private negotiations that resulted in this piece of policy. We did not make any decisions or formulate any specific plan in that private meeting. We're back to openly debate and make decisions in the public one now. And I see Mayor Masters' mic is on. Please go ahead. Mayor Masters.
I moved this, right, to begin with?
I believe so, yes.
All right. I'd like to withdraw that move and replace it with something. However, there's a deputy city clerk missing right now.
Yeah, they're just working on the wording, so maybe hoist this and go to the other questions
Okay.
about the...
We'll come back to this as it relates. Leave it on the floor, so
We'll be flexible.
Okay, and Councillor Moll, please go ahead.
Okay, so we're still open for questions on this?
Yes, we are.
Okay, so I just have the one. So what did other teams do in the CFL in this situation?
I'm not aware, and I'm not sure if Ms. Krulak is or not. She's temporarily away, but I'm not aware.
Yeah, okay, you have nothing to compare it to.
I don't have anything, and I don't know what their lease terms were or how things
Okay.
worked for
I got
them.
I imagine that situation never
Yeah.
really goes public, does it?
Councillor Moll, if I could just interrupt for a second.
Yeah.
We've kind of scattered our administration to formulate some wording that you
Yeah.
bring back we can discuss.
Yeah.
That really pertains to the rider side of this motion.
Sure.
If you have any other questions on the audit side for the finances and anything else,
No,
I
that's
think we're
fine.
better equipped for that at the moment.
Sure, thank you.
Mr. Humphries, please go ahead.
Through you, Jason. Now, I'm going to be talking about the midterm forecast. I got a couple questions on that.
Yep.
Just a very minor point, in AFC 2424, page 2 of 7, it states the general operating fund is projected to have a deficit of 2.4 million. On page 3 of 7, in the discussion notes, it shows a deficit of 1.18 million. And in the chart on page 4 of 7, it shows a $2.45 million deficit. Mr. Schistler stated it was 2.4 million. I'm just wondering what the correct number is.
Through the chair, sorry, Mr. Humphries, could you,
Yeah. Oh,
did you say
so
page 3 of 7 for that second
Page
number?
3 of 7, yeah, in the discussion notes. It identifies a deficit of 1.18 million. That's in AFC 2424. And then in the chart on page 4 of 7, it shows a deficit of 2.45
Yeah,
million.
sorry, through the chair, 2.45 is accurate.
Is right? Okay. Okay.
I'm listening to two things at once.
Oh, sorry.
Mr. Chair, I know that there was some changes made late to this report, like obviously prior to today.
Right.
So we did have an incorrect number in there, and I'm wondering if perhaps, there weren't a lot of changes, but that was one of them, and I'm wondering if perhaps that version you're looking at, 245 is accurate.
Okay, okay. Through the chair, as detailed in Appendix 1, 2, and 3, almost every city department is forecasting to significantly overspend their budgets. The forecasted mid-year over expenditures in the general operating fund are forecasted to total 10.133 million. In my time with the Audit and Finance Committee, the city's overspending, city departments overspending their budgets has definitely become normalized. Now, I can understand how unforeseen emergency situations arise that warrant additional funding. However, what I can't understand is how almost every department in the city in the first 6 months of 2024 has been blindsided by unexpected operating expenses. In my past life, I was responsible for the departmental budget at a SAS Crown Corporation. Staying within the approved budget was a priority. Overspending the budget was rare and reflected poorly on the department. The bottom line for the corporation was not used as justification for fiscal failures of individual departments. From what I've seen, I question why departments have a budget at all. It appears meaningless on a departmental level because the only number emphasized is the total forecasted deficit. Perhaps you can help me understand the budget process by answering the following questions. What is the departmental priority to adhere to the approved budget?
Thank you, Mr. Humphries.
Okay. Through the chair, I'll start and Ms. Kurlak will provide some details. So, and budgets are very important. Obviously, the city of Regina, the budget process is completely public. We also are unable to run a deficit, so there are implications to not being on track. I would say we're at a mid-year forecast, as we advised in the report. And we, those numbers can vary as we go forward. I would say overall, it's about a, just on the expense side, it's about a 2% forecasted variance, which is of concern, and we don't want to see that, but it's not dramatically large. I'd say budgets are paid attention to and monitored, and there are times when things on a project, or as you say, an emergent thing, but there are other things where it just makes sense from an operational perspective to go slightly over budget. There may be other factors to consider, but from a priority perspective, budget is a very serious high priority on where we're at and what we're doing, as well as resource allocation, large projects, et cetera.
Through the chair, when departments are asking for additional funds, are they required to provide alternatives that they could take to stay on budget and the consequences of doing so? And I assume that the budgets for each department are approved by the executive committee. Maybe you could clarify that for me too.
Please go ahead, Kim. Mr. Ehrlich.
Through the chair, so budgets are definitely set, and they are vetted through city administration, and they are brought to audit and finance and council for approval ultimately. The one thing that I do want to flag, depending on which appendix that you're looking at in the mid-year report, Appendix A-1, which separates revenues by category versus the department expenses, and A-2, which shows the budgeted revenue and expenses for each area. The variants look a little different on each table by department and division. And the reason for that is, in some instances, we receive grant funding to do work in year that we don't anticipate, and then we have an offsetting expense. So we'll have increased revenue, but then we'll have an offsetting expense. So it looks like we're overspent, but we've actually received the revenue. So that is one instance. We do have other items that are unbudgeted and unplanned for. Winter road maintenance over the last couple of years has definitely been an impact to our last two deficits in the city, where we had extraordinary amount of snow events, and as best as we can try to plan for some of those items, we can't always anticipate them. So the emergency shelter is also one of those unbudgeted items. So as we move through the year, there are these unknown factors that are not known when we set the budget. One of the other things I will note is we do our overtime budget, as previously discussed at this table and at council. It has not been right-sized for many, many years, and so that is another impact to our overages. So there are multiple moving parts, but I wouldn't say that it's department's intent to overspend. Some of the other variances that you may see are due to reorganizations in year, where positions may be moved from one department to another. So one department showing the savings, another department is showing the offsetting expense. So there are multiple reasons for some of these changes.
Through you, Jason. So when the departments have developed their budget, is it approved by the director before it goes to the executive committee for approval, or how does that process work?
Through the chair, essentially managers work with their directors to put forward a budget. There are budget cases that also move forward for new asks that may or may not be approved at the executive table. There is a lot of discussion. We also do discuss whether or not, should we, if we don't want to impact service, what are the implications? If we don't get this position or we don't get additional funding in order to allow us to do this work, what is the impact to the citizens?
Jason, I have 4 specific questions, and then I'll be done with the midterm. Fire and Protective Services shows a budget increase of $833,285. It says it's for salaries and benefits, equipment, training costs. And I'm just wondering, how could that not be foreseen at the beginning of the budget cycle?
So through the chair, I'll maybe start, and I'm not sure if one of my counterparts would like to weigh in as well, but with regards to fire, there has been things like unforeseen paternity leaves or maternity leaves, which causes, there's top-up that's paid to these individuals while they're on leave that we're required to facilitate through the payroll, which we would not have known at the beginning of the year. And then we have to backfill those positions, or it might result in increased overtime to cover those shifts. So that would be an example of where we could not foresee when we set the budget.
Okay. Through the chair, Land, Real Estate and Economic Development realized a higher revenue, but still showed a $762,615 deficit, partially due to transferring money to reserves. Now, besides Land, Real Estate and Roadways, they still have a deficit. I mean, yeah, they moved money to reserve, but they still had a big deficit. And it's to the mayor's point too, like, if you move money to reserves, doesn't increase the deficit. I mean, but anyway, so besides the real estate and roadways, were there other departments that transferred monies from their revenue source into the general operating fund to reserves?
So financial services did transfer funds into the GFR and the ARR, or it's reflected in the forecast.
Okay.
Based on the recent council decision. So in quarter 1, financial services had I believe, an over expenditure of approximately $115,000 that was tied to a position that was transferred to my area, but the budget was remaining somewhere else. So someone else was showing the savings, I was showing the overage, and now in financial services, you're seeing the transfer, the increase in revenue and the offsetting transfer to the reserve on the expense side.
Yeah. Through the chair, with everything going on, you still had a $10.133 million operating deficit though, right?
Correct.
Of that deficit,
through the chair, it's a forecasted deficit.
Yes, yeah, for sure, yeah. How much of that deficit could be attributed to monies that were moved to reserves? And I know that's a wrong question, but...
Oh my goodness. Off the top of my head through the chair, I don't know that exact number.
Okay. All right. My last question. Now, Appendix C shows $8,702.78 repayment for Qs and CERS. Now, does this include the interest, or are we still waiting to hear from CRA whether we're going to get a refund or a reduction in interest?
So through the chair, to my knowledge, we are still waiting on a ruling from CRA on the return of interest. At this time, this amount included what we knew at the time we put the report forward and council approved this payment. However, interest was accruing at that time that we did not reimburse REAL for the additional amounts or EDR. So they were responsible for any interest that they incurred past our date that included the 8.7.
Okay. So through the chair, Jason, if you could come back to me when we start talking about the overtime, that'd be great.
Appreciate it. I just want to insert one question myself. I see I have a couple of lights flashing, but I don't want to take a turn. I was looking through the budget, trying to place events that I witnessed in the last year to the placeholders where it shows up in the budgeted items. So we had that big water runoff break by Albert Street, by the Albert Street Bridge, by Wascana. I knew we had to set up a pumping situation there to alleviate water concerns. I knew it was quite costly, and it was kind of unbudgeted money. And I'm just trying to look for transparency in the budget to find out where that sits, to understand how the money flows better. Can someone help me out with that? Mr. Doney.
Through the chair. So yes, as you mentioned, in 2023, we had a major storm pipe failure. And so the large extent of that expenditure was in 2023 because that was the emergency response. The pit was dug, the pumps were put there. And so that would have been in the 2023 operating budget of the utility. And so what we're seeing in 2024 now is just the ongoing rental of those pumps until we put a permanent solution in place. So although significant, the cost of that is not going to be significant on a $175 million budget.
Okay, so I get it. It would have been the accumulated amount over both years, and I might have been able to find a placeholder in the budget, but because it's spread out, it's not quite significant enough to show up within the numbers at this resolution.
Through the chair, that's accurate. And what you will see in the budget request is going to be a $5 million request in 2025 and a $10 million request in 2026 to implement the permanent solution.
Thank you. I wanted to make sure I was paying attention to my numbers and not missing something. Please go ahead, Mayor Masters.
Thanks. That inspired another question. Let's leave Mr. Doney's mic on. I think Councillor Mancinelli kind of raises one of the points that is frustrating sitting on this side, which is budgeted work versus unbudgeted work. And so in that situation, handled, right? Like we have a failure of a system and it's MacGyvered, it's handled in that year. Well, you take the time to put something in place. Where is that work reported? Like the budgeted work versus unbudgeted work and how it's reconciled at year end? Because you do have a surplus in a utility, so there's a bit more breathing room there.
Through the chair, and so you would see that, you're not going to see that detail, but you're going to see it rolled up in the utility operating account. And so in our operating, we've got water, wastewater, and stormwater, so that particular one would be in the stormwater account and would be reflected in the overall utility operating. And then you're going to see the big expense, which is the utility capital budget request in 2025 and 2026.
Do you believe there's merit to the public when we have infrastructure failures to understand how that fits into the budget at your end?
Through the chair, I think it's really important to try to connect that dot, because if we don't invest, we're going to have more of those failures in the future. So if you can see what the impact is of reactionary costs compared to proactive, you'll see it's much more efficient to be proactive.
I agree with you. And so how difficult would it be when you're reporting in at year end on the budgeted versus unbudgeted work? I get you roll it up, but you can roll up those two numbers separately in terms of this was the amount of work that was budgeted and this was the amount of work that was unbudgeted and how it was handled.
Through the chair, a little bit complex when we go from a utility perspective because we're dealing with, for example, water main breaks. And so we have a certain amount that's budgeted based on history. But there will be, of course, dry and wet years, and the unbudgeted amount is a bit more challenging. Something we can endeavor to look into. Just my struggle is the departmental budget versus the corporate roll-up, and that's what I'm not sure how that can be committed to, but we can definitely look into that.
I think to that point, if it sits in your departmental budget, if we're seeing quarterly where transit is and where water and wastewater is, you're doing the numbers that, but on a capital report, on an operating is fine, but on the capital report, I think budgeted versus unbudgeted work that gets performed is important, because I agree with you. I think the investment that you guys have been doing has got us some savings and reduced the number of breaks in a year, all of those things. But it is frustrating, and I hear about it often in terms of, well, how does that get paid for when that budget was approved? Is there delegated authority just to spend more money? Or is there adjustments made in construction? Because I know that happens. And I will just say this, everything you do is attached to an address, right? Everything you do is attached to an address in a civic street, and so we know that your construction maps that come out are incredible. I think you can map the unbudgeted on there just as easily, right? Just a thought. I'm not going to say for this much, don't panic for this year end, but I'm suggesting that that's probably the level of disclosure we're looking for, especially because the investment is so good. Mr. Humphreys asked a really interesting question, the way he framed it. When a department is asking for additional funds, so who on the budget, who's over, asked for additional funds off their budget? What's the policy around that?
Through the chair, that would be a discussion with managers and directors and then their deputy city managers. For example, with my overage that I showed in Q1, I had a conversation with Mr. Lacey that he was okay, he was showing the savings and I was showing the over expenditure on the position that was being transferred to my area. So those conversations should be happening throughout. Also, I have been doing a lot of work with my team, which has been short-staffed, to ensure that they are having those discussions with the operating areas as we're moving through the forecasting process to get an understanding of the dynamics or the moving parts within their forecasts, and specifically unbudgeted versus budgeted on the operating expense side as well. So it is an improving process that will continue to evolve.
Thanks. So what's the policy attached to dollar numbers, like percentage-wise past a budget? Like if I've gone 5% past already, because for whatever reason, and it hits 10% past my approved budget, what is the policy which says it gets escalated to whatever level, and when does it come to council?
We don't, through the chair, we technically do not have a formal policy, I would say. But the discussions are ongoing and part of our quarterly reporting.
I'm suggesting that'd be a good policy to be developed. Have I got this right, just to check what it is? Right now, mid-year, end of June, September, end of June, we were 2.45 million in deficit, and the year-end forecast is 2.45?
That's our, through the chair, that's our current projected year-end forecast as of June 30th.
So how do you get that to zero? What's the plan to get that 2.45 closer to zero?
Through the chair, we do not have any, obviously we'll continue to monitor our expenses and have those discussions to see where we can reduce expenses or perhaps may receive additional increased revenue that was unforeseen at budget time. Again, we do work towards having a balanced budget and not intending to move to say that we're ending with a deficit, but sometimes there are events that are beyond our control tied to unbudgeted expenses, and we're trying to get a better idea of what those are, as well as right-sizing the budgets that we know that haven't been looked at over a number of years. So we're hoping that a lot of this will be mitigated with the 2025 budget process.
Understand that. I'm going to ask you a question. If there wasn't an investment policy right now that said anything past the budgeted investment income needing to be transferred into reserve at that 50-50 ratio, would we right now be looking at a report that told us we were $550,000 in surplus?
We would have a projected surplus.
That's what I thought.
historically, that revenue has typically been utilized to handle over expenditures in our operating.
Which has allowed work not to be done in terms of right-sizing budget or managing expenses or creating policy for blowing past. Understood. I'm going to ask the question again. What's the plan to get 2.45 to 0? Because I don't think we'll monitor is that's not a plan. How do we get that closer to 0? Because we know there's hiring freezes. We know there's pulling back from programs for the balance of the fall. We know there's things that can be done. So what is that conversation like, knowing that we're now $2.5 million in deficit projected? Anybody want to guess where it goes? I don't think it's getting better unless it's being managed. That's my thought. So how are we managing that closer towards 0? What's the plan?
Through the chair, through the forecasting process, directors and managers will have to work together to determine where there could be some savings, as well as there may be decisions need to be made where we are impacting services to the citizens as a result, especially in terms of hiring freezes that might actually also trigger increased overtime expenses if we're not filling vacancies. So
Right. We see that in transit.
It is a balancing act, and we would have to do, obviously, as I noted, we have to do a little more work around that. So I wouldn't say we necessarily have a set plan at this time.
Mr. Doney, how many transit operators have we hired this year to date?
Through the chair, I don't have that information, but what I do know is that we hired 13 extra operators to reduce our overtime, and so that's why the memo that was provided to you and some of the reports you're seeing, reduction in transit overtime. We think that's a good strategy going forward. We're looking to do that in 2025 and beyond. When you talk about, just to add on a couple other things I might add to the conversation, in order to reduce our budgets, we will need to reduce services. And so one very small example that we did in roadways, we had a conversation. Spring sweep happened this spring. We had a late snow that came, and there was a conversation of, we're behind schedule. Do we do overtime to make it up, or do we not do a bit of the spring sweep? We talked about it. We decided not to do a bit of the spring sweep. So a few kilometers of road didn't get swept. Not a big impact. Not a, those residents might have been a bit concerned, but not a big impact to the system. So that's a small example where the conversations are starting to happen to know that you can reduce budgets, but it will have a direct impact on services.
But those conversations haven't happened around the $2.5 million deficit we're sitting in right now.
Through the chair. So that'll happen going forward, I would project, but at that kind of amount, I would think you'd have substantial service cuts that I would look for direction from council if we're willing to go there.
How many unfilled positions do you have in your department right now?
Through the chair, I don't have that information.
Does any deputy city manager have the number of unfilled positions in your department right now? Okay. Mr. Humphreys, I think to your point of the normalization, because historically right now we'd be talking about a surplus because that investment income, and that's only been the last few years. Previous to that, I'm not sure how it was handled, but there's been cushion. And I actually believe every department does need a bit of cushion in their budget. When we have to balance to 0, and no other level of government does, there needs to be some cushion for each department. But I think it's problematic when a deficit shows up and no plan to address even mitigation, right? You might not be able to get it to 0 because, to Ms. Kralich's point, I think there are, unforeseen circumstances, although sitting with 1.2 extra in a winter fund, which we're happy about because we blew through it in the last couple of years, right? And we blew past that budget. And I appreciate that example that you used because we know, I think that was $1 million overage last year, wasn't it, in R&M, where we did a spring sweep and contracted it out, and it cost a lot of money, right? So that's a great decision. I'm actually all for a hiring freeze right now. In the absence of information of the impact, I guess we'd find out the impact if we made a motion to that effect. Because I don't know how many positions that affects right now, but we should. All right, Matt. I'll stop talking, Mr. Humphries. You go ahead.
You suggesting that we make a motion forward to council for a hiring freeze?
Buddy, I vote yes and put it on the floor.
All right, I'll, yeah, I would definitely make that motion, but I do have one question. If council was to mandate a balanced budget,
It's already law, it's legislated law.
no, but I guess to reduce the deficit from 2.45 to 0. I mean, that's law, that, somehow that happens, I suppose. Would that give the impetus to the individual departments to start looking at options to reduce their budgets? Is that what it takes? Because I didn't hear a plan.
I think the fear of this conversation
Yeah.
right now might be what it
Yeah,
takes.
I didn't hear a plan. I haven't heard a plan for 2 years, and it's been the same. And, you know, I doubt that there aren't things that can be done operationally, like was just addressed, that would reduce the budget to a point where we wouldn't have to worry about it.
Yeah, and listen, sorry, if I can just respond to that. Sorry, Jason, through you. I think there's some really good work being done on some of this stuff. Like, I think we're years behind where we should be, both on policy as well as just the reporting structure. And that's years' worth of a lack of investment in coordinated IT assets and all the rest of it, which allows HR to talk to finance, and there's a really big manual process to doing this, and so I'm actually really appreciative of the work that administration's been doing. And in the, at $467,000 on a, whatever, $600 million operating budget, that's pretty good.
Right.
But when it creeps up, and again, I don't think it goes south from here, the lesson I've learned is it goes north.
Right, yeah.
Is that there has to be something. And so I don't know that we don't just ask for a plan to come back,
Right.
right? Even the plan to come back to mitigate by year
Yes,
end,
right.
like, I think would be
fair.
a fair thing, and create a discussion that again, you can see some of that work's already happening.
Yes.
It's-
In certain departments, but it's not
Yeah,
universal.
yeah.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
guess we're kind of hitting conversation time here instead of committee time. We should kind of pull it in and get back to it.
Hey, it's not council, this is like executive
That's okay,
committee, my
that's
friend.
okay.
All right,
We did put some work into an amendment when we had convened in private for a second to bring back to discuss. Is that something we want to bring up in this?
Well, I'll make a motion that council approve a hiring freeze for 2024.
Okay,
I'll
I
make
guess
that
that's a
motion.
motion on the floor right now, and you don't need a seconder. So I guess that's the motion on the floor. And I guess we can speak to that motion then.
Can we speak to that motion yet, or?
Yep, speakers to it.
Feels a bit,
Direct. I don't know what admin would do if they were asked to come back with a plan to balance. What exactly would you do? It may include a hiring freeze. You may remember, like in the province, we would probably have had a bunch of reduction items to bring to decision makers to say, you know, if this is, you know, if going over isn't an answer, here are some tough choices, decision makers. Here's the options that you have, and bring those sorts of things to you so that, you know, quite frankly, the decision to do something different than bound would lie with the decision makers, council. So I don't know if that's an exercise that you could undertake. It's, the problem with these things now is when you're halfway through the year, more than halfway through the year, is you've got limited impact, right? So you'd have to get on this pretty fast. And if this is coming back to council on September 25th, you know, that's pretty tight. But rather than be directive to say, you know, do this to admin, you know, you might be better to say, bring us back a plan by sometime, and not too long, to balance with options. And I just, yeah, admin, what's your reaction to that?
through the chair,
Please go ahead.
through the chair, I mean, we'll do the work to look at what we can do. I appreciate the notion of a hiring freeze. Right now, just got some numbers hot off the press. We're at 1% vacancy corporately. I can't break that down for you in the moment here, but basically, permanent positions are basically filled or being recruited for or backfilled. There are very few permanent positions vacant. So 1% would be less than 30, and some are in process. So just for context, the problem with freezing one item in the whole budget, and that is salaries are a very large part of the budget, absolutely, is that which vacancy comes open, right? So sometimes when you want to constrain that, you say it can't be more than this expenditure, but if 2 vacancies come open, or some other budget expense goes down, you can use it because you absolutely need that one other, person to do that job because it's critical for service levels or what have you. Now, I know we don't get down to one person sometimes, but there are places that are smaller areas, for example, and just to use our finance area, we've had a lot of turnover. We're looking for a lot of people. If we froze hiring in that area, it would have significant operational concerns. So, appreciate the notion, and I understand it's a cost control notion if I'm hearing it right. Whether it's come back with a specific plan as we're heading towards the end of the third quarter. There's a usually better forecast at the end of the third quarter. Everywhere I've ever worked, the third quarter are a little bit more accurate. Which way they go, we'll see, but yeah, they are more accurate. But it might make more sense from an admin perspective to say, come back with your forecast and as part of that process starting now, specifics on how you're going to reduce this deficit, including things like constraining hiring, constraining out of budget, non-service level related expenses, those types of qualifiers. The hiring freeze, and again, it could be fine for 4 months. It could be problematic in certain areas. If it's a complete freeze, or if it's you got X right now, you can't have any more than X until we approve a new budget, but within that you can manage or whatever. I don't know if I'm making sense anymore. I'm just repeating myself, Mr. Chair, so I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schisler. Please go ahead, Mr. Doney.
Just want to add that, so we're managing the service levels, and so if we do a hiring freeze, unless we change the service level, we will increase overtime or increase contracted services. So that's an offset that would have. I don't think you'd necessarily see a reduction in cost unless we're willing to talk about service level reductions. Now it is almost October or September, so like I mentioned, that window's closing quickly to have a drastic impact on costs going forward.
Appreciate that. Just wanted to comment myself. A hiring freeze is a good tool for budget reduction. There's always lots of tools in the toolbox. You can't use every tool for every problem. And you got to analyze how you're using the tool. And when I consider the information I've received in the past year, some of the information from employees about pressures within the workplace, as well as our ask for the overtime freeze, correlate that with the information in the report as well on how many departments are managing their budgets through salary like currently. Those are all indicators that there's some pressures there that maybe a hiring freeze isn't the right tool at this time for the budget problems we're seeing by the information given. So I couldn't support that. But with that, Mr. Schisler's comment on analyzing it and coming back with options, whether it be a freeze or something else, knowing the direction of the budget and knowing that that's a cooperative mechanism to work with administration with, I think would be wise. I think that would be smart. So I could support that. I guess with that, is there anyone else who wants to speak to that motion? Councilor Moll?
You're looking at the wrong light.
Oh, actually, Mayor Masters. Sorry.
Thank you, through you, the chair. Mr. Doney, when's the last time you came to council with a service level reduction recommendation?
Going to read this policy.
Microphone.
Through the chair, I don't recall the last time I came to council with a service level reduction.
Mm-hmm.
Typically, the pressure is to increase service.
But you would know better where money could be saved as opposed to the response that council has to residents as it relates to a service level. But you would know far better in terms of where opportunity would exist.
Through the chair, absolutely. And I'll give an example that, not recommending it, but dust suppression, prime example. I'm looking at a couple councillors that probably wouldn't agree with that based on where the ward is, but that's a prime example where not a critical health and safety service level, very nice to have and very important for those residents. But if we did not do dust suppression, that would be a council decision that would reduce the budget. We're getting late in the year based on the season, but that's an example that we would know, yes, better than council of what options could exist for budget reductions.
Do you need direction to have those conversations with your managers? Or is that just something that should naturally occur?
No, through the chair, I think that naturally occurs in every area. So that's one example that we've had the conversation with. I said, you know, I've given the direction of no, proceed with it because that's the established level of service. It is a budget request for 2025 to increase, to right-size our budget because we don't have the budget right now to do dust suppression as we've taken on roads, as we've expanded the city. Another prime example I mentioned was spring sweep. So we had that conversation, we made that decision, and yes, there's an impact to level of service. So I don't think there's direction needed. I think everyone is listening to the conversation and we'll take it back to our teams, but knowing that in the majority of times you're going to have service level impacts when you reduce, when you're trying to reduce the budget.
So in the absence of a plan to mitigate $2.5 million deficit, no, I'm actually going to ask the question. I'm very curious, Mr. Sisler, why a plan would be presented or why a mid-year forecast would be presented. And you talk about third quarter, which we get in December, which is year end. Right?
Through the chair, yes, that final report would come, yeah. I mean, obviously, the administration would be aware of where budgets are at and could have that discussion earlier, yes.
And I know you're new. I get it.
Thank you.
Would it not be normal course of business that if you were running a deficit, there would be mitigating plans put in place? And you may not get to zero. My 30 positions at an average salary of $85,000, which I believe is the average salary in the city of Regina at 30% of the year, is about $765,000.
So, through the chair, yeah, and I think I'd agree with you. And I think some of these things are, I've created a deficit somehow, and I have an ability to take some action, and sometimes something happens, and it's created, and I can't really change that. So something happened that was completely unexpected, and the only thing I can do is cut other things, and so sometimes that's not the place people go, especially if there's required service levels or whatever. But I think from I'm running a deficit, I've got these challenges, I'm off some amount and it's kind of operating, it's not a specific unknown thing that happened, then yeah, I would agree with you. You should be looking at whatever level you're at. What can I do to try and bring this closer to zero, and understanding what is variance that can be addressed by year end and what isn't, and understanding why.
And would it be helpful, in fairness, I think Mr. Doney to your part as well, would it be helpful if there was a policy developed that talked about the flexibility and service levels when we're running a deficit? If in conjunction with that there was a policy on who can and cannot exceed budget without approval? Like is it the flexibility in the service levels that's needed in order to mitigate some of this stuff? Because I keep hearing we're standing behind service levels going, well, we'd have to cut service levels. And that causes panic, but I don't know that the few kilometers that weren't swept this summer actually make anybody's radar.
Through the chair, I'll give another example because I've given a few roadways examples. Transit is a bit more rigid. So if we're going to cut service levels, we will stop running buses on certain routes. And my team's messaging is lighting up here. So for example, we know ridership is low in a certain number of routes. And so we could stop having those routes run for the rest of the year. Administration would not make that decision because it's established service level that council approves. And you know, we could bring out something to council to have that impact, but that would not be typically something that administration would say we're going to stop.
Right,
transit
but
routes.
pick something inflammatory versus, like, I'm going to go back to your road sweep,
Right.
which is, I don't think the residents of Regina, okay, residents of Regina aren't going to raise such a fuss about a couple kilometers that don't get swept, right? There's a service level standard which you made a discretionary call versus ones that impact, frankly, welfare and life, which is transit, right? And so we can choose the inflammatory ones. Well, we'll just send the firemen home. Well, let's not talk silly. I'm talking about all the others, like you need flexibility. I'm talking about policy from council to say you have flexibility in the back half of every year in order to balance the budget. And would that actually cause departments to pay more attention to managing to what has been approved?
Through the chair, after we right-size the budgets, I think that's a very good conversation to have. But there's many items in the budget, and you'll see it in the 2025 budget, where there are not budget allocated to services. So another example, railway maintenance. Railways send us a check or send us a bill every year to do maintenance on their railways. We don't know how much that is, and there's no budget for it. That's going to be a request in 2025 based on the last few years. So once we right-size our budgets, I think that conversation is more, will have more impact, because then we have the budget based on what we think is going to happen, and all we should see going forward is either the unexpected things or changes that council have made.
Got it.
But
Okay.
we're not there yet.
And so, how long has it been since we right-sized a budget?
Through the chair, many, many years. I
So-
don't have that in my history.
Any thoughts on why we're hearing about it now?
Through the chair, I'll speak to it. I think why we're hearing about it now is because our budgets are getting tighter and tighter. We've seen inflation increase, and so there is very little flexibility in the budget. In the past, items were covered either through increased revenues, unexpected revenues, or it was just the ability to absorb was there. It's not there anymore. And so to meet those service levels, we're seeing consistent over expenditures.
Okay. I appreciate that answer. Thank you.
No problem. I believe it's the 5:30 break. We could pause there, and I just want to mention when we get back, we should probably make a note to get through this a little bit quicker, because we have quite a few pieces of policy to get through in this meeting yet. So we'll pick up the pace just a hair.
Recess till 6.
It's a half-hour break right now, too. Oh, boy, at a half-hour break, we're eating all our meeting up, but,
Dinner.
yeah. Recess till 6, it's the supper break. Okay. Guess I'll call the meeting back to order. Just wanted to mention, we're past 6 o'clock already. We have quite a few matters on the docket yet. So if we could move this through to get some other matters, it'd be appreciated. The debate's important, that's why we're here, and I don't want to cut anything important off, but a little bit more at task would be probably good to get our work done. So we'll carry forward. Mr. Humphreys, please go ahead.
Oh, through you, Jason, I wanted to withdraw that motion that we had. And we're going to replace it with another motion. Mayor Masters is going to replace it with another motion.
I see your light on right now, and I think coming off a break will be well planned, so I'll let her go ahead here. Please go ahead, Mayor Masters.
I've got it ready to go.
Yeah, just 1 second. I'm just going to check with the deputy clerk about something. Because I can just look. I'm good. So as I moved the original report, Mr. Chair, I'll just withdraw that and we'll replace it kind of all as one. Both the language around the Rough Riders reduction in rent for the cancellation of the CFL season, as well as the issues around the mid-year review. We'll just get it up here so you can all see it. It's okay. It'll come up on your screen in just a second. So you'll see that Audit and Finance Committee recommends that City Council retroactively reduce the rent by 1.33 million of the 3.6 million accounts receivable regarding the Saskatchewan Roughriders Football Club rent at Mosaic Stadium for 2020-2021 Canadian Football League seasons, which in whole and in part for 2020 and 2021 due to contractual provisions once the payment for the remaining 2.2 million is received. All right, and then 2, approve this recommendation September 25th. And 3 is to direct administration to report back to its October 9th, 2024 council meeting with options. I think that's council. Sorry, yeah, I know what you're doing. Nope, it's okay. I just think after October 9th, 2024 council meeting, I think it has to say. Yeah. With options to mitigate offset, the mitigator offset, just keeping in mind we may not be able to offset in its entirety, so mitigation, the projected operating deficit of 2.45 million, and instruct the Audit and Finance, we're asking council to come back to us, to instruct us to develop a policy that in the event an operating deficit is projected in any quarter, that administration be required to report with options to balance the deficit to the Audit and Finance Committee, which then goes to council, essentially. I'm open to language changes, we sort of did this on the fly, but.
Thank you, Mayor Masters. Looks to be in relatively good order. Is there any questions from the committee?
Mr. Chair, may I ask one?
Please go ahead.
I just want to ensure on the $2.45 million projected deficit.
Oh, sorry. I didn't.
No, it's okay. On the $2.45 million projected operating deficit, that includes EDR, real, that's what's included here, right? Those are the appendices? Oh, and CSIR, sorry, and community and social, hang on a second, and community and social impact Regina. So we have, I think, three of our municipal corporations' financial statements attached. And so I just want to ensure that the $2.45 million operating deficit that's been projected includes the roll-up of the 3 municipal corps.
Through the chair, those are individual quarterly statements from our service level partners. They are not consolidated into our forecast like they typically would with our year-end financial statements. So those are reports that are required as per our UMA agreements with those entities to provide information to administration and subsequently council on their current financial status.
Okay, and so based upon the information provided, what would the projected deficit be if these ending June statements were rolled up?
Through the chair, I don't have that off the top of my head. We could quickly calculate it, but I do want to note that it does not include Buffalo Pound as one of our service level partners,
Yeah, not included.
They come separately, so.
That's in the utility too, I think, as well. So, yeah, no, it was more, it's just the three that are attached, CSIR, EDR, and REAL.
So their CSIR is actually projecting a surplus. REAL is projecting a deficit. I'm just trying to quickly.
Please go ahead, Mr.
Through the chair,
Chisholm.
can I just ask a question, Mayor Masters? Are you looking for this for additional information, or are you looking for it to crystallize the number in Part 2A of the motion that's there?
Yeah, it's Part 2A of the motion.
Okay, so,
Just to make
In-
sure that the operating deficit,
Okay.
this is the city of Regina's operating deficit without the
yeah,
partners in it?
so I'm wondering, that's what's reported now, and that's the number, and not trying to get away from any accountability, but I'm wondering if it might be better to describe, to mitigate or offset the operating deficit of the city of Regina, including, so I'm on Appendix A, but for example, we include police here. We add police at the bottom, and EDR, and REAL, and I'm wondering if you could just itemize them, because two things, we're coming up to the end of September where a new forecast will be created based on what we know 3 months later. And so, like if that totals, whatever, 3 million or 4 million, the number.
Do you want me to just take of 2.44 mil?
Yeah, I'm
Just
wondering
take it
if you
out?
wanted to describe like across the city of Regina, including, I mean, or if we just have that clarified. I think I'm helping, but I'm not sure. I think you're trying to get the whole picture.
To mitigate, offset the projected operating deficit.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And to instruct, yeah, okay, I'm
Yeah.
good with that.
And then if we understand it correctly, just for our own understanding as we're doing this work, it's City of Regina. It's basically Appendix A plus those other three organizations.
I
What
think
are-
anything that's contributing to a
Right.
deficit.
And you're not saying come back with a plan to get it to zero, although.
That's why I used the
Sure.
word mitigate. I
Right.
included the
Yeah.
word mitigate
So
because,
what are reasonable measures we could take
Yeah.
to make a material
Yeah.
reduction in the deficit by year end?
yeah.
Through the chair, I just want to note that we don't typically receive regular reporting, like aside from what's outlined in the UMA agreements, from the service level partners, so that if we are looking to include this in, and some of them only are required to report twice a year and not quarterly, so I just want to understand the direction if we're including the service level partners, because that will need to be a communication with them.
Yeah, I think one of them is biannual and the rest are quarterly. Oh, sorry, but again, excluding Buffalo Pound, but
Real is the only quarterly.
yeah, so that's fine. The other ones have pretty small budgets in comparison as well, so, but we don't name anything here. This is really just to mitigate, offset the projected operating deficit. So if it's the first quarter and we know what we know, then we know what we know.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I would put that on the floor and, I'm good.
Please go ahead, Mr. Humphries.
If I'm reading the financial statement of Real correctly, as of June 30th, 2024, they're projecting a deficit of $18.3 million. Am I right on that? And if that's the right, or is it 2.32 million maybe?
So through the chair, I think it's important to note that Real's statements, quarterly statements, are based on public sector accounting, like our year-end financial statements would be, and our operating forecasts are not done in the same way. So you have to take into consideration things like
Amortization.
assets and liabilities that would be balance sheet items that wouldn't technically be coming through an operating forecast. That's fair.
So we can't really compare the information in the financial statement for real with what we've done here.
So I think there is a statement that summarizes it a little clearer. There's a statement of loss, which is the second page, I believe,
Yes.
of the
Yeah.
appendix,
Yep.
that will show you the loss of from operations.
So that's 2.32 million,
Nope.
and to June 30th, 2024.
You're seeing
Or actual, I guess, yeah.
I think you're referring to the cash flows.
Looking at the budget.
Or a net loss actual 6.9595 million from what I see on
Yes,
the statement of loss.
that is correct.
Yeah, so my
So-
question, yeah, sorry.
Therefore, it's not, we would have to take into consideration and do some work with the service level partners to get it into
Right.
a format that would be similar
Yeah.
to what the city is using for forecasting.
So I would ask Mayor Masters, if you want to include real in the motion, are we also going to include their $6.59 million deficit?
Nope.
No?
No, I believe there'll be something coming forward to council, which will have its own thing.
Okay, all right. Okay.
I have a question about that. To wrap up these numbers, not just for this year, but for next year and subsequent years, as we're formulating this motion, is about transparency. And to have the total accumulated loss across all partners kind of becomes important. I know in the past year, we've had real come so many times for an ask for a loss that is accumulated that it's really been confusing to the public. We're setting policy right now, not just a one-off year. So with that in mind, do you think we should wrap real into this?
Do you want us to wrap the partners into it?
I know it's inconvenient and not politically smart, but that's not the job here. The job here is to make sure that we develop good policy. I know, but this is about developing good policy, so I think that's what I want to do.
Yeah, so what is the projected loss for real right now? Is this-
6.595 million, say 6.6 million. That's the actual loss to June 2024.
That's not a forecast.
Net loss?
Please
for
go ahead,
period?
Ms. Sisley.
Wake up.
Yeah, on the statement of loss, which is as Ms. Krulak outlined on page 2 of Appendix E to this report, you'll see the statement of loss for real. In that first column, actual 30 June 2024, down at the bottom, 6.595 million. That's actual to the end of June. That is their operating loss at that date.
Right,
There's
yeah.
no forecast here.
Right, yeah.
The next column is budget, and then the furthest to the right column is a year-over-year comparison to where they were a year ago at this time. So there's no forecast here.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Is there a reason there's not a forecast? We normally get forecasts from real, so this is what I'm curious about.
I'm not certain, and I'll ask Ms. Krulak to comment. I know there are, as the mayor referenced through the chair, that there are items about real and its financial position coming forward to exec committee and council. I don't know if it's next.
September 13th.
Yeah, so, sorry, next week. Those will deal with where they're currently at in forecasts and premise facilities and all those types of things. So there's 2 reports on that schedule. I know they're required to send us these updates quarterly. This is what's in here for reference. But it's more likely we'll get a more robust picture of where they're at and what's needed next as that analysis is completed. And I just hear these are the facts at the end of June, and there's a lot of work going on outside of just reporting the results on real. That'll come forward shortly.
Oh, sorry.
I was trying to get this kind of I was leaving it out because it just gets it through a bit cleaner, but I don't know that if council doesn't come back with the instructed audit and finance, we can't include it within the instructions to come back to audit and finance as it relates to amending UMAs to ensure we get quarterly reports that include forecasting.
Oh, so let it go as it is right now and
Yeah.
as we
And when we come to council, we can speak to, you can add it as
Okay.
chair, right, just to say there's a bit of a,
discrepancy.
yeah, as it relates to the way it impacts our financial statements.
Okay, I would be satisfied with that, and we do have to get through this, so I guess if there any other comments, we can go to a vote. I'll call the vote then. Anyone opposed? I was waiting for the voting machine to come on. I see no opposition. Passed unanimously. That was item 1.
It's a big one.
Yeah. Okay, we will now consider item number AFC 24-23, MN 24-5 Reserve Fund Policy. Can I please ask Mr. Jim Nicol to introduce the report? I'm just reading off my script. Is there someone else? Oh, I'm sorry, I saw scribbling there and I thought we passed it already. My lack of glasses. We will now consider AFC 24-25, the 2023 Annual Reserve Report. I'd like to just make a correction, whoever moves the report, if they would move it with this correction. Appendix A, page 13. There's errors on the small tools fleet replacement reserve. Administration will speak to it when they introduce the report, so when we move it, it would ask that it be moved with the amendment to refer to that error. And now, can I please ask Deputy City Manager Ted Chisler to introduce the report? Who can I ask to move the report? To have a mover of the report with that amendment from the committee floor? Any one of my committee members can move that. You guys? Okay, thank you, Mayor Masters. Please go ahead, Ted.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. This is the 2023 Annual Reserve Report to City Council as required by the Regina Administration Bylaw. The report provides an overview of reserve balances as of December 31st of 2023 and provides projected balances of each reserve through to 2028. Reserves are monies authorized by City Council to be set aside for future capital and operating needs. They're a key component of the city's strategic priority of operational excellence, supporting the strategic goal of achieving long-term financial sustainability. Reserves continue to provide a mechanism to support the future maintenance of assets, new infrastructure, and sustainability of the city's services. The city continues to follow industry best practices and municipal benchmarks in the stewardship of reserve funds. Prudent reserve management, solid financial management overall in general, has helped the city earn and maintain a AAA credit rating through Standards & Poor's Global for 3 consecutive years. Administration has some recommendations in the report as well, including a recommendation to amend the bylaw to create a new tourism reserve with the recent transition of Tourism Regina into city operations from the Regina Exhibition Association Limited. This new reserve, if approved, would also incorporate the events, conferences, and trade show sub-reserve that is currently housed under the Community Investment Grants Reserve. Colleagues and I are here to address any questions, and I will cover that correction to the numbers, if that's all right. So just in detail, so you know what we're talking about, again, on page 13 of the reserve report. So if you're there, under the small tools fleet replacement reserve, about 2/3 of the way down the page, but halfway through that narrative paragraph, it says, at the end of 23, the reserve balance is $275,000. That $275,000 should be $321,000, which exceeds the maximum limit of, should be $221,000, not $175,000. So again, that sentence at the end of 2023, the reserve balance is $321,000, which exceeds the maximum limit by $221,000. And then the table below, basically that entire bottom line that says variance from, and it has 175 all the way across, should be 221. And that table is in thousands. So there was a small error there. The remainder of the report is corrected. Really is a typo. No, we haven't found any
accounting issues or anything. It's just an error in the report that we discovered earlier today.
Thank you, Mr. Schisler. Appreciate the information and catching the error and informing us. And Mr. Humphries, please go ahead.
Sure, through you, Jason. I assume we're going to be voting on the recommendation at some point? Through you, Jason, are we going to be voting through for the recommendation in here to have the tourism reserve combined with the ECT reserve? Yeah? Okay.
Yeah, we'll be coming
Yeah,
to the end
sure.
of the debate.
Okay, my question is, I'm assuming that we're going to vote to approve that. Are you proposing to transfer the closing 2023 balance of $431,000 to the tourism reserve? Or are you going to just transfer the $325,000 2024 addition to the ECT reserve? That reserve is on page 20 of the report.
Through the chair, so we would be essentially transferring, if this is approved, we would make updates and transfer whatever the current balance is in the reserve in 2024.
Right.
If there has been activity in that reserve, we can't backdate it to 2023, so we would transfer based on actual transactions through the reserve, which may not be exactly what the forecast is at
Right.
this point in time in the year.
At this point, yeah, through you, just this point is 488,000, but there could be a reduction.
Correct.
Yeah, okay. I'm just wondering, the executive committee reserve description seems to align with special events and tourism. Was there any consideration ever given to incorporating the executive committee reserve into the tourism reserve?
Oh, so through the chair, that is a subset of the larger community investment grants reserve.
Right?
So the executive committee reserve, it does provide support for special events, not necessarily in the same manner. It could be sponsorships and those types of things, whereas the events, conventions and trade shows reserve, sub-reserve is more tied to events that the city is putting on, things that we want to do, so things like Grey Cup or the Memorial Cup or the Briar or those types of things.
So tourism wouldn't be involved in those?
Not necessarily, I'm not
Oh.
saying, like, it's not a clear, through the chair, it's not a clear or a clean break. There's always some intricacies and overlap.
Right. One of the main reasons I asked is we're getting a lot of reserves and some of them are, well, I'll get into it in the reserve report, but now, is there a reason why the CIGPR has no minimum or maximum limits identified? And no additions or restrictions shown past 2024?
Through the chair, are you referring to page 19? In the Community Investment Grant Reserve?
It's actually page 21, the Community Investment Grants Program
Oh.
Reserve. Yeah, page
Okay.
21, top of page
Through the-
21.
Through the
Yeah.
chair, that is a sub-reserve that has been repealed in prior decision items and bylaw adjustments that was never fully addressed or cleared. So through this process, for transparency purposes, we've included it here, and those balances will be transferred into the appropriate areas based on that repeal.
Oh, so that reserve will be gone?
Yeah,
Okay,
it's
great.
done.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, that's it, Jason? Yeah.
Thank you very much, Rob. Please go ahead, Mayor Masters.
Thank you, through the chair. In terms of the ECT sub-reserve, the request is essentially because tourism exists now within the city of Regina, this would make sense to put it in the tourism reserve. just the basic gist of it. In terms of page 2 of 7, policy impact, the approval of the recommendations outlined in this report would require administration to amend the events, conventions, and trade show policy, but the city manager has delegated authority to approve changes to the policy as required. So why do you need our approval if the city manager has delegated authority?
Through the chair, it requires a change to our bylaws.
Sorry, but right now, the city manager has delegated authority to approve changes to the policy?
Through the chair, what page are you referencing?
Page 2, under policy impact, second sentence.
Right. Oops. Through the chair, the policy is separate from the bylaw that would establish the reserves.
Okay. Thanks.
Please go ahead, Mr. Humphries.
Okay, I just have a couple, are we going to vote on the recommendation before we talk about anything else in the reserve report? Or?
Yeah,
Okay,
once
well, if we vote,
move
it's
on.
done. Okay, I have just a couple of quick questions here. Through you, Jason. It states that the Planning and Sustainability Reserve is funded through fees and charges. Why are we spending millions per year with no money being added to the reserve? In 2022, 2023. I don't have a page. So that's on page 17. And it shows millions of dollars being spent every year, but no addition to the reserve.
That's part of it. Through the chair, this is tied to development activities. And so when we move through capital projects, when there's development similar to the service agreement fees, or the SAF as we would call it, a lot of times we collect revenues back on the tail end after the development occurs. So we'll see an expenditure out of the reserve, but not necessarily income coming in right away.
Okay. So we have no projected additions to the reserve right now? And we can foresee?
Not at this time. Not in the next 5 years.
All right. Okay, just my second question. It states that the solid waste reserve will stay within its maximum until 2027. The table clearly shows it starts exceeding its maximum limit by 4.4 million in 2025, increasing to 18.1 million by 2028. You recommend no action to this reserve be taken as it will be used to cover future capital costs to close the landfill. What is the life expectancy of the landfill, and what are the estimated costs to decommission it?
Through
Mr. Dillon, please go ahead.
Through the chair. So the life expectancy of the landfill, we're looking at another 25 years or so if we can continue diversion, and the cost to decommission it. From memory, I think we're in about that $50 million to decommission the landfill, another $50 million to add, expand the landfill.
And is that money all coming out of this reserve?
Over the life of the landfill, yes, it needs to be funded out of the solid waste reserve to have it a self-sustaining service.
All right, okay. Our last question. The social development reserve, is there a reason why the city carries a balance of 5.14 million a year when the maximum forecasted is 2.5 million a year?
Through the chair, I didn't quite hear.
Oh, sorry.
Nope, that's
The social development reserve, is there a reason why the city's carrying a balance of 5.14 million per year when the maximum forecasted expenditure is 2.5 million per year? That's on
Yep.
page 24.
So through the chair, we do receive applications through the Social Development Reserve.
Right?
So we anticipate that we're at least spending what we're contributing to the reserve in the year. And it's dependent on the amount of applications that would come in for us to fund and approve. There are things like the housing improvement program tied to that reserve. But it is essentially application-based.
Right. I guess my only concern would be we're carrying a closing balance there every year for the project till 2028 of $5.13 million. And there's no minimum or maximums identified for the social development reserve. I guess, it seems a bit excessive to me, but that's just my opinion. That's it for me, Jason.
Thank you.
Unless there's a comment.
Yep.
Yeah.
I heard.
Yeah.
Okay. I guess I see no more questions coming through. So I just wanted to follow up with a comment along Mr. Humphrey's line on the solid waste reserve. Knowing that the set-aside is mandated by federal rules and we have to have decommissioning money set aside, also tying that in with the large investment we've put in diversion, the assumptions we built the set-aside with would have changed with the diversion investment we've given. When did the utility rates change to show the investment we've made and offset that cost to the public for that set-aside?
Through the chair, I'll provide an answer, and if it answers your question, great. If not, just reword that for me, please. So when we set the solid waste fees for our garbage pickup, our blue bins and our green bins, we updated the solid waste financial model to see what we needed to make sure that that service was cost recovery, and in addition to the landfill. So yes, we are seeing diversion happen, and we're actually seeing less volume coming to the landfill, which is bad from a revenue perspective, but good from an environmental perspective. So that model does change a lot, not year by year, but 5 years at a time. There's definitely assumptions that need to be checked regularly. So we're still on a good trajectory where we're diverting waste and extending the life of the landfill, but it is something we have to keep an eye on because the revenue is dropping, but the cost of closing landfill is the same.
Appreciate that. With the revenues dropping, the cost of a landfill being recovery and so many private users, does the collection fees change to offset the revenue decrease after the diversion?
Through the chair, yes. So the long-term financial model is really dependent on the tipping fee of the landfill, and so council did approve an increase of that last year, I believe, and that is what we would look to adjust in the future if the revenue dropped to a point where, or if the volumes dropped to a point where the revenue is too low to handle the future costs.
Thank you very much. I think that answers and lets me something to think about. Please go ahead, Mayor Masters.
How long are we going to be doing additions to the reserve of 8 million? Do we stop in 2028?
Through the chair, so the way the solid waste service works is that anything that is basically any revenue that is above our operating costs goes to the reserve. So no, it will continue to go as long as we operate the landfill and our operating costs are below the amount that we intake. So it's a 25-year model, and so projections are that it will continue to add to it, but it won't, I wouldn't project it'll be $8 million a year. It'll continue to drop as the
Yeah,
volumes drop.
6.7-ish, it
Yeah.
kind of keeps coming down. And so where does the surplus go, because you're sitting in surplus right now of $11 million, right? So, in terms of your minimum and your maximum, so,
Through the chair, I'll just clarify, so the minimum maximum is 28 million and 48.5.
right.
And so at the end of 2023, it was 41.6.
Oh, sorry, 66, yeah, it's 18 million. So, sorry, I was looking at 2028, I apologize. So in 2025, is there a reason that we wouldn't transfer the 4.4 into the general fund reserve or into asset replacement? Is there a reason we wouldn't do that?
Yeah, through the chair, completely a direction of council, but typically what we see is that we're going to have increased costs at the landfill. And so, for example, we're looking to do some horizontal drills for methane capture. Based on these numbers here, that's not projected in this 2023 financial model. So that's stuff that you'll see going forward in 2024 and beyond. So it's something that we look at regularly. Instead of, it's a choice of council, but instead of transferring excess money from a reserve, we would, to keep it self-sustainable, we would look at more reducing either our waste management fees, our fees for our blue cart, green cart, and brown cart, or the landfill tipping fees, if we thought over the life of the model, 25 years, that we didn't need that revenue. But that's not the projection right now.
Sorry, in terms of this model, for the purposes of this report, is there a reason we wouldn't drop the additions to reserve if we know that income is going down? Why would we leave it at 8?
Yeah, through the chair, that's definitely something that will be updated as we go forward and work closer with the finance team to make sure that the additions to reserve reflect what we're seeing in the field.
And just to verify, the $48.5 million maximum that is sitting there, that max is intended for decommissioning, is that correct? And it's about a 50% offset?
Through the chair, yeah. So the primary reason is to maintain and keep the landfill active from a capital perspective, but also to decommission the landfill. So, you know, I think 48.5 million is a little bit low from a decommissioning of a landfill perspective over the long term, but I think a lot of the mins and max need to be reviewed in context of increased inflation and things like that.
Sorry, so the max isn't really for decommissioning, it's actually just to keep in reserve in the event we have a problem at the landfill?
No, it's both. So it's to decommission the landfill, but it's also to support capital projects at the landfill. So we install new wells, we do landfill gas to energy project, things like that. So all that is funded under the solid waste reserve.
So in year 2028, when we're $18 million over our maximum, just let me guess, it says we don't recommend transferring the excess out of this reserve, right? So I'm going to ask you a philosophical question. Why is a landfill more important than another asset that we build?
Through the chair, I don't know what I would say the landfill is more important, but there's definitely long-term liability with the landfill. And it's also historically been a self-funding service. And so just like the utility, we don't typically charge user fees and then take that and offset other costs. So I wouldn't say it's definitely more important or not, it's a self-funding service.
Right, but when we go in excess of reserves, we would transfer those out then into other projects, right? Just sit at the maximum and be done with it?
Through the chair, we would utilize that funds for solid waste projects. We would not typically transfer it out to use it for other services.
Because?
Because it's a self-funding reserve, and if we thought we had too much funding, typically what we would do is lower the amount of revenue coming in.
Okay, I'm good, thank you.
Please go ahead, Mr. Humphries.
Yes, so on the solid waste reserve, so you say you review it, you're on a 25-year plan right now. In 2028, you're forecasting $8 million over the maximum. So, and to address that, you would look at reducing the utility fees for the solid waste program, if I understood you correctly. How often do you review that, and what would the maximum what would the amount have to be over the maximum for you to make that review?
Through the chair, so we would review that on a regular basis. Annually would be the objective. But when we're looking at long-term costs, so if we're talking about a decommissioning of a landfill at, you know, $25 to $50 million and lots of other capital projects, we would look at it over the 25 years. So we may go above that as long as we have a plan that we're going to come within the min and max in the future. So we wouldn't necessarily bring a report to council to say we're going to reduce the revenue if it's only above for a couple of years. As long as there's a capital plan that is required, that'll bring that back into the min and max levels.
Right. Do you have any plan to bring a plan like that to council? What would trigger it, I guess, is my question.
Yeah, through the chair. So what would trigger it is that if we see the closing balance going up substantially over the life of the model, like over 25 years, and that there's not a large capital need. But we know there's a large capital need coming in 25 years, which is the landfill closure. So we don't project that happening right now. But if, for example, our volumes substantially increase at the landfill and our revenue increased, then that would be a trigger that we would bring that to council.
Please go ahead, Ted.
And through you, Chair. On page 33, there's a 5-year reserve projection, the overall, position of the financial reserves. And, they're decreasing, fairly substantially. That has, that's the intensification reserve, I think, has a lot to do with that. But that's not a great overall financial position to be in. At the same time, and I've got a bit of a question about our debt too. Debt will be increasing for the city. So in the future, we've got limited ability to handle anything that might come at us sideways when you look at that reserve balance. Our debt has already, we've committed a fair bit to new debt, which I also have kind of a side question as to why that is not coming here. I would be very interested to see, the debt proposals. Just more so than like the deficit that we just dealt with of $2 million. When you look at this financial problem, it's in the hundreds of millions of dollars. So, just get your assessment. Am I seeing this right? Do we have a financial problem in the future of significant magnitude?
So through the chair, yes, the reserves are projected to decrease so significantly over the next little while. It's mainly due to us completing our planned capital projects in large part, and tied to our 5-year capital plan. So there is definitely potential. Budgets are getting tighter. We don't have the surpluses to move forward. We're trying to get infrastructure and capital projects completed. But we are undertaking a reserve review in 2025 that will be digging into the details of these individual reserves a little more, and assessing mins and maxes, funding sources, and items like that. So I don't necessarily, it does look just
Doesn't look good.
concerning, I guess
Yeah.
is the word, from a bird's eye view at this time. But it is largely due to our investment in infrastructure.
So if you have no room on the spending side, then you've got a revenue problem. I'm not sure of the debt repayment plans for the debt that's being proposed, where that funding comes from. I don't know if it's reflected in here or if that's new.
It depends on the capital project that the debt is tied to, and so it could be tied to utility through the chair, or it could be tied to operating. But there is a debt servicing component that is built in and forecasted as part of our budgeted processes, so.
So it would show up on the operations, but right now there is no dedicated revenue to repay that debt, other than general
The
revenue.
new debt that
Yeah.
we're incurring,
Right,
nothing at this time.
right.
There's a projection, but
Okay, I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you, Mr. Morrow. I see no further questions. Who was the mover on this? Was it Mayor Masters? Yeah, I guess it doesn't really matter. I think it was moved as the, yeah, the mayor moved it as presented.
Yeah.
So there's no amendments or anything else to move towards, so I can call the vote on it. Anyone opposed? I see no opposition. Oh, yeah, it was moved with an amendment for the error. That's what it was. Okay, we will now consider item AFC 24-23, MN 24-5, the reserve fund policy. And this time I'm going to ask City Clerk Jim Nickel to introduce the report.
Thank you, Chair. The discussion item before you tonight arises from a notice of motion that was presented in May of this year with respect to the reserve fund policy. Due to time limits at a particular meeting, when this was at council referred this back to Audit and Finance, and due to some scheduling challenges, it is now before you tonight. And this motion was put forward by Mayor Masters, and so I believe she will be speaking to the contents of it.
Thank you, Mr. Nickel. Mayor Masters, can I ask you to move this, and would you like to speak to it?
Board. This is from when? Just kidding. Just kidding.
May. Back in May.
Yeah. Yeah, honestly, this was just in an effort to avoid, sitting on funds in excess of their maximums without review. Seemed absurd, and so if there was the inclination to increase minimums or decrease minimums or increase maximums, that the balances accumulating would be triggered by something like this, which of course are surplus tax-funded reserve balances, to be amended. So that was why it came forward. We can recommend City Council adopt the recommendations contained, amend them, or recommend this to City Council. Ultimately, this comes out of budget of last year, and part of this is just about the transparency a little bit of how money goes away. And if you notice this, that we have some very well-funded reserves and some that are not so well-funded. And general fund reserve and the asset revitalization for sure need to meet their minimums. So this was just a matter of creating a policy that would automatically trigger a review or request from administration into council to increase a maximum as opposed to, because this, I will tell you, when this comes forward to council, it's usually, yeah, whatever. Oh, it's not being recommended? Great. But the reality is I'm sure you've heard it earlier today, we don't have right-sized operating budgets. We have some funds that are self-funded, which are incredibly healthy, and others without minimums, maximums, and others which are underfunded. So, and the general fund reserve being one of them, one of the most significant ones being, which again was the investment policy, and then this one as well, just to ensure, because transfers of the general fund reserve have to go to council anyways. So this would just be a way of automatically triggering a review of maximums. I think that was it. Jason, you were kind of in on this one too. Do you remember this one?
Yeah, I do, and I think the description is accurate. I guess one of the other feelings is this comes back to transparency. All the money above board, and should the asks cause the amounts to come out of line, it brings transparency to how much is being asked of administration. I think that they take on a lot of extra burden from political asks during a year, and this allows that to happen without that transparency to put pressure on it. I think a piece of that was wanting that constant transparency to the public.
Yeah, and sorry, and I'll just add in, I think on point number 4, there was a commitment in June of 2023, when the last time we saw the annual reserve report, that there would be a review of the reserve policy and reserve model and have this completed and presented, well, gosh, right now. So that's not happening, but I did hear that there's a reserve policy and reserve model being reviewed in 2025. In fairness, they're trying to catch up on a whole bunch of improvements, so be it. So the only thing I would amend, I think, is Q3 of 2025. Does that make sense? Q3 of 2025? Does that work? Okay. That would be an amendment I would make on point number 4.
Appreciate that, and that concludes that. I can see there's some questions. Please go ahead, Mr. Humphries.
Yes, through you, Jason, and I just want to follow up on item number 4. I hope that when the review is done, that whoever's doing the review looks into some of the reserves, like the Social Development Fund, and comes up with some explanation as to why they're carrying $5.14 million, and also looks at some of the reserves that are not being used or of such insignificant value that they don't warrant a standalone reserve, like the Small Tools Fleet Replacement Reserve hasn't been used for 2 years, carries $321,000. I can't see why it wouldn't be moved to the Fleet Replacement Reserve. And the Regina Police Radio Equipment Reserve hasn't been used for a while, so just to try to consolidate the reserves and reduce the number, because I believe we approved, if I'm not mistaken, Chair, we approved adding the tourism reserve, didn't we, in the last?
Yep.
Yes, okay.
I just noted administration had a couple comments by your
Okay,
comments.
sure,
If
go
I could
ahead.
let them answer.
Go ahead.
Please go ahead.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. So yes, we will we will review the reserves, and including all the factors you mentioned. Is this an appropriate reserve? What are the minimum maximums? How can we better report and explain on what's happening or not happening? One thing that I would mention is some reserves, while small, need to be a reserve because their source of funding and their purpose are specific. So they are held separate so that there's a clear accounting. It's not a bunch of extra admin, it's just a clear, this money is for this purpose, it's from this source, and this is how it's been spent, and it's not commingled with anything else. So I'm not prejudging how we may come out of this, but you may still see some that are small because they have a unique source of funding or purpose, and we need to keep them separate. They can be a sub-fund or whatever, but we need to keep those separate. But yeah, we will look at, and in the totality of this motion to look at what reserves are necessary, do we make any changes, minimum, maximum clarity and what that means, how we deal with maximum, above maximum and below minimum, and what are some of the rules, and when do we come to council. So I think it's this holistic review we've already talked about and agreed to, and I think it's a good idea at this point. I'd also note that from looking at other municipalities, we appear to have one of the lower numbers of reserves, believe it or not. So I take your point. There's a lot in there. There's a lot of moving parts. But I think, like anything, a good update. Obviously, there's some challenges. There's some challenges in probably everybody in this room trying to understand the way certain things work. Let's try and address those challenges and make it clear and transparent, to the chair's point. But there may still be some that are, why is that there? Well, we'll be better able to explain it, but it may still be there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Humphries. Please go ahead, Ted.
Yeah, just, there's a lot of recommendations on this recommendation. I'm just, what was City Council's issue with the way it was presented originally? Were they, it wasn't presented?
Please go ahead. Mr. Nicol has some history.
Yes, there was actually no discussion at the meeting. It was on the particular meeting agenda. It ran late, and as part of the tabling of items to future meetings, council directed it to come back to ANF first. So there was no discussion at all about it.
Okay. So there was no issue with it or anything that we need to resolve, okay? That's fine. I just, on the recommendation, the first two, number one is really, I think, the heart of what you're getting at. There's a lot of other direction here. I mean, you can choose to leave it in if you like, but it seems to me the heart of it would just be one.
Appreciate that. Any other comments or discussion? Please go ahead, Mayor Masters.
I take your point for sure about when, I think the, point 2 and 3, because these are actual bylaws, that piece of it, and then getting an actual date on it. So 2023 reports to come forward, and it slides through as not having been completed. And there's reasons it wasn't, like there's workload, there's all those reasons, but it never actually re-registers. And so this is getting it kind of written into the surface. And then as it relates to 5, 6, and 7, we made an investment policy decision. There's an interconnectedness between reserves, capital, and operating. And you can see, even as you see how the reserve funds are funded, sometimes it's right out of operating that we're transferring money into reserves. Sometimes it's surplus, sometimes it's those things. And so the interconnectedness between how capital projects are funded over years, and then when they're not funded, how is the reporting on, and I think on the capital carry forward report we saw in June that Mr. Lacey produced, he said, well, this was a lot of work, but we found out we have $11 million left over that we've completed projects and they were under budget, and we're $5 million over in this other thing, and so you had a net $6 million. It's kind of found in a way. So there's an interconnectedness, and again, that transparency between transfers, funding, surpluses is kind of important to sort through, essentially. Anyways, I think that's what I remember.
Thank you. I see no other mics on, and, the last comments you were making there, Mayor, trigger my memory as well. These totally were brought about by the transparency I mentioned earlier and budgets. And the timeline to get them through is evident by the dates. It's been a tough year. You mentioned with moving it that there was an amendment to the date. Have those all been captured?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. And with that, I'll call the vote. Anyone opposed? I see no opposition. And next up. Okay, just a reminder, the meeting was at the call of the chair, and with that, moving one matter forward in the queue, we will now consider item AFC 24-28, the Bank of Montreal Bank Extension. This is brought forward from a private matter agenda point, and I'll ask Deputy City Manager Ted Schisler to please introduce it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Bank of Montreal and Moneris agreements, they're together, are ending on May 1st of 2025 and September 1st of 2025, respectively. Administration is asking to extend these contracts for an additional 2 years to allow us to send out an RFP to seek a potential new provider or to renew it. We would require council's approval to do that. We are satisfied presently with the services. It is a matter of, do we need to do this now? Things are working well. There's a lot going on. We will do it. We just wish to extend the current relationship for the extra 2 years. And for your reference, a full RFP to the major banking players in Canada from start to finish runs about 18 months to move things and assets and lending and all that kind of stuff. So what the report is really asking for is that 2-year extension, and during that period we will run an RFP, just not for spring of 25. Thank you.
Appreciate that. Can I have a mover for this? Mayor Masters, any comments? Or questions? Questions are good too. Nope. I guess I do have one question. On a matter this large, what are the associated fees and savings the city could capture or lose by this type of contract?
Through the chair.
Just a rough idea.
I don't know that I have a number for you. However, we do, essentially our contract terms would remain the same. There would be no changes. Currently with the changing economic environment going out to RFP and tender, obviously interest rates are significant. We currently have a set interest rate on our line of credit and tied to our purchase cards, which is tied to this agreement as well. So everything remains status quo at this time. I'm not sure if that really answers your question, but.
I wasn't sure if you had that much dedicated information. I was just curious, so thank you for indulging me. And please go ahead, Mr. Schisler.
Oh, I was just going to say in the report at the top, under financial impact on page 3, it notes that our current provider will continue to waive all general banking fees. There's other fees we pay, but, so there may be some small opportunity, but I don't think there's a large risk if we push this 2 years. The interest rate environment would be the same reasonably across any provider. So it's really about, as you said, that combination of the fee, but also the level of service they provide to an organization this size.
Okay, appreciate that. Thank you. I see no further questions or comments. With that, I'll call the vote. Any opposed? I see no opposition. Okay. Get back into my proper order here. Next up, we have AFC 24-26, the capital expenditure report, and once again, Mr. Schisler, please introduce him.
Thank you again, Mr. Chair. Just finding my, there it is, all right. Capital expenditure report. On July 9th of 2024, City Council considered report CR 24-53, capital project and reserve funding, and directed administration to include in its future annual capital project and reserve fund reporting standardized public reporting by capital projects and programs exceeding $500,000, detail and schedule, variances, options, drop projects, capital carry forward projects, status of those, and the annual reserve fund report reflecting the transfers out of reserves sitting in capital carry forward accounts, and the percentage of completion reporting. As part of the city's financial plan, we set capital operating budgets each year, as you know, and take into consideration service level agreements to maintain service standards and community priorities. The 5-year capital plan outlines where the money will be collected and spent in line with the city's priorities according to vision, mission, values, and long-term financial and strategic plan. The city has significant capital carry forward amounts that relate to projects that have been approved and not completed for several reasons, including multi-year projects and various delays. As of December 31st of 2023, capital carry forward for the general capital fund is $179.7 million, and the utility capital fund is $204.9 million. In 2024, a total of $133.1 million was budgeted for the general fund capital projects, and $105.9 million was budgeted for the utility fund capital projects. Amendments include $1.4 million and $1.3 million respectively for the general fund and utility fund, providing total available funds of $314.3 million for general fund capital projects and $312 million for utility capital projects. As of June 30th, 2024, actual expenditure for the general fund is $35.1 million, which accounts for 11.2% of total available funds. Actual expenditure for the utility fund capital projects is $60.4 million, which accounts for 19.3% of the total available funds. As of Q2 of 24, the forecast is $198.8 million and $191.8 million for the general and utility funds respectively. The projected capital carry forward as of Q2 24 is $115.5 million for general and $123 for utility fund capital projects. There's a lot of information again in this report, Mr. Chair, and my colleagues and I are happy to answer your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Schisler. There was a lot of information in this. I'm still trying to reread it 3 times. Any comments or questions for administration? Oh, and I need a mover as well, if I could have a mover. Thank you very much. Mr. Humphries? Yep. Floor is open for comments or questions. Should I call a vote here? Is everyone satisfied with reading through the information and we should move along? I guess I'll start to speak for myself. I asked for this information and I appreciate having it. It's a little bit overwhelming. There's a lot to absorb and I don't have a measurement to put it to because I've never had that much put to me before. But to actually realize what's going on and for someone to kind of track and look forward at the changes going on, I think will be quite useful. And once, used to using the information. So thank you for the work you've done and I appreciate it. If I have no other one to speak or ask questions, I'll call it to vote and we'll move along. Call the vote. All in favor? So moved. AFC 24-27, the audit recommendation status update. And I'd like to ask the internal auditor, Jennifer Vinishwanathan. Sorry for hurting your name there. I didn't mean to. I'm trying to get better, I promise. To introduce the report.
Thank you for the introduction.
Thank you.
Good evening, members of the committee. The internal audit charter requires a city internal auditor to report on the progress of implementing action items that arise from the internal audit report. This report presents the status of recommendations implemented or in progress for the central stores and parts inventory report presented to the Audit and Finance Committee last year. This audit was primarily conducted for 3 departments: central stores, parts and fleet. Both the transit and fleet departments were combined. As of 31st July, 3 of the audit recommendations have been fully implemented and reported by administrations as complete. 23 recommendations that were due to be completed are in progress, and 1 recommendation is closed. Implementation due dates have been revised for the recommendations that are in progress. Internal audit, this is the first audit status recommendations update report. Going forward, this will be a biannual exercise. We'll be reporting out twice a year, once in Q2 and another in Q4 of every year. The next status of recommendations will be presented to the Audit and Finance Committee in Q2 of 2025. That will contain all the progress of recommendations in progress right now, as well as the recommendations made in other audit reports in 2024. Administration and staff continue to work towards the completion of outstanding audit recommendations and meet the target completion dates. Internal audit will continue to support the departments in their efforts to implement audit action plans timely. With that, I'm open to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Mr. Humphries, I see your mic on, so I know you'd like to move this as well as ask the first question. Please go ahead.
Concerns that only 4 of the 27 recommendations have been implemented to date?
Through the chair, this recommendations are arising from the audit report that was presented last year, the inventory audit report. And one of the primary control improvement points identified in that audit was that we need to have an inventory control policy and procedure. We didn't have that till that time. So this was going to be an extensive exercise that covers not only the 3 departments that we audited, but also all other departments within the city. So a lot of good work was undertaken at that time to bring about the policies and procedures for the first ever time for the city, or to create some policy around the inventory management piece. Now, due to some personal changes and so deadlines couldn't be met. But with the implementation, that's now at the final stage. Actually, we have it's now at the final stage of draft, and once that policy is implemented, we'll be able to complete the other recommendations more easily.
So the answer would be no? You
Sir?
don't have any concerns about only for the 27 having been implemented? You're okay with it?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
I don't have any concerns
Okay.
right now, because I know a lot of work has been done, and they are still in progress.
All right. That's it, Jason.
Thank you, Mr. Humphries. Please go ahead, Mayor Masters.
Thank you, through you, Jason. Thank you very much for this. I appreciate this, but original due date to revised due dates. What happens if they slide past their revised due date?
So the original due date is the commitment that administration makes based upon the initial recommendations that are available. Once they progress towards implementing the recommendation, they might see some other items that might require more work than earlier anticipated. So they might request for moving the implementation dates. So these can happen based on prior experience. It can happen more than one time. It is likely that some of these recommendations could be, they could ask to revise the dates again. That could very likely happen for some of them. And if that be the case, then the report that comes out in Q2 will also contain the revised dates and the previous original dates with them.
No, I'm going to ask it. So when is the sliding date no longer acceptable? When do we have a performance issue?
So when we track dates, it is always with the original date. Even if the administration asks for extension and date, let us say some were committed in Q3 or Q4 of last year, and it is moved to Q4 of 2024. We ask for the reasons for the delay, and we also kind of try to showcase why the reasons, whether the reasons are acceptable in nature. And if the dates keep on progressing, moving, keeping on repeatedly revised with different reasons being attributed to it, there is a time then we need to be concerned about it.
Right.
There is no.
Well, we are a year past when we started implementing, and there's a year and a half extension requests. So that's 2.5 years past where we started from. Is 3 years too many? Like what?
So with respect to overdue recommendations, that is those that are past more than say 3 years, they are highlighted differently. Since it's the first report, we don't have that many recommendations, that many reports to track. As we go on building these recommendations and reports, we'll be providing additional details on the aging of the implementation of items. So if, let us say, some of these recommendations are over their due date for more than 2 or 3 years, they will be highlighted for the committee's attention separately.
Okay, I appreciate that. I appreciate the work.
Please go ahead, Mr. Humphries.
Through you, Jason. But at this point, you don't have any delegated authority to force departments to comply with the in-service dates or the...
Through the chair, that would be purely with the administration to implement corrective actions. Furthermore, that would be a conflict from my side if I am asked to implement recommendations.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Humphries. Oh, please go ahead, Ms. Anderson.
Thank you. Through the chair, I would say as far as delegated authority goes, myself and the leadership team have delegated authority, frankly, to set priorities and performance expectations. And I will say that what this report highlighted for me, I actually met with Dinakar last week, is that we need to resource this work differently. And we need to reallocate resources so that we have someone whose sole job it is to project manage the implementations of the audit recommendations, and likely be from a more centralized location, not just from the finance department. So what I would say is that my promise to you is that this report for us highlighted that this isn't something that can be done off the side of a desk. And in fact, when I got the report, I said, well, the report is really well written, but what's not good is that we're severely behind on the implementation. If we have someone whose sole job it is to project manage that, frankly, if we are behind, sometimes there are resource constraints. But frankly, that should be a conversation that we're having with audit and finance, that we're having with council members to talk about reprioritizing or reallocating resources for all of the work that we have to do.
Thank you very much, Rob. Any other questions or comments? Seeing none, appreciate the conversation. Thank you for the work, Dinakar. Really appreciate the comments from Ms. Anderson. Looking at what was completed and in progress, it looked like any physical activities to do with tightening a screw or fixing a key or tightening a doorknob, super easy and got done to be cooperative. But the real change from within is the trick. So I think that performance management, and that is the key. So I'm happy to hear that's on top. I see no other comments, so I'll call the vote. Any opposition? Okay, all in favor, unanimous. Good to go. Thank you. For private now, correct? Yeah. Can I have someone move a motion for a private session? Thank you, Rob. And we'll have a 10-minute recess while we set up for that and reconvene. Thank you, everyone. That's the end of the public session.